The reason the Primarchs were scattered was so that Erda, the mother of the Primarchs, could keep them away from the Emperor. And it's kind of funny because in some cases, the result was objectively worse.
What's that supposed to mean? I'm very busy.
Well, I'm sure you are.
I don't like your tone.
I'm sure you are. How's that?
Hi, I'm Chrono the Harlequin, and welcome back to Live from the Black Library, where today I want to talk to you about the adoptive parents of the Primarchs. Now, as many of you will know, this video is actually a remake of an older one on my channel, which is now since deleted. That's because it had quite a few mistakes in it, and I rightfully got called on it. I had planned to remake this video years ago, but it ended up falling to the wayside, so I'm here today to set the record straight. What I had messed up initially was the parentage of Ferrus Manus, Horus, and Corax, as well as some tidbits about Guilliman, Vulcan, and Lorgar. But before I get into it, I just want to say thank you so much for watching this video. Please subscribe if you have not already done so, consider supporting me on Patreon, or joining my Discord server, both linked down below, and without further ado, once more, with feeling, let's get into the parents of the Primarchs. Now, as with the Primarchs themselves, some are a fair bit more important than others, and show up in the story a lot more. So we're gonna start off with the logical number one, and a really strong one, Luther, the adoptive father of Lionel Johnson, Primarch of the Dark Angels. And the reason I say this one is really consequential is not just because, well, he's a lot more prevalent in the narrative than other ones, it's because his direct actions had incredible bearing on the story. You see, when it comes to a lot of the adoptive Primarchs' parents, their biggest influence is how they raised the Primarch in question, what influence they had on them, and how that would affect them going into the Great Crusade and horusheresy. Luther, by contrast, actually affected events with his personal actions, because he was present in the legions. I would say he, second only to Cor Ferron, had the biggest direct impact on the galaxy. As many of you know, the Emperor created the Primarchs in his image so that they could be his sons and generals who would lead his armies as he reconquered the galaxy for humanity, reuniting its shattered remnants after humanity's first empire had collapsed, because faster-than-light travel had become impossible for a time. However, while still in their incubation chambers, they would be scattered across the galaxy by his enemies, be that either the Dark Forces of Chaos, Erda, the genetic mother of the Primarchs who wanted to subvert his plans, or something else entirely. And Lionel Johnson would land on the forest world of Caliban, which was infested with dangerous demonic warp beasts. However, several knightly orders had developed to combat these beasts and keep the people of the world safe, the largest of which was led by Luther. And he, after having lost his wife and daughter to these beasts, would find Lionel Johnson, a child in the forest who had somehow managed to survive. He then adopted this child as his own son and raised him to adulthood, which, considering Lionel Johnson is a Primarch, did not take long. And it was very clear that Lionel Johnson was no ordinary child. But the problem was, Luther was playing second fiddle to his own son now, because first Lionel Johnson surpasses him in ability, then becomes the new head of their order, then unites all the other orders of monster hunters on the world, then is approached by beings from the stars who are loyal to an emperor and want to take him on a great crusade to unite the entire galaxy. It's kind of hard to feel inferior when you're up against that, and sure, reasonably we could see that nobody ever had a chance of standing up to Lionel Johnson and looking impressive. But still, that's a hard pill to swallow when before this, you were basically the number one guy on the planet. And it's not surprising that bitterness began to build in Luther's heart. So he would eventually, during negotiations with a planet to be brought into the Imperium, turn a blind eye to the fact that they were trying to sneak a nuke on board the ship. But he would have a change of heart at the last minute. Still, though, the damage was done and he was in trouble. He would be banished back to Caliban, but defy that banishment order to aid the Death Guard in their fight against another nearby group. But he would be reprimanded for this when the Lion found out he had set foot off-world. It would be from here that Luther would turn to chaos and start turning the world of Caliban against Lion and the Imperium. And while this had very little effect on the heresy itself, it did result in the destruction of the planet, and Lionel Johnson being placed in a 10,000-year coma that he only just now woke up from. Now, here's the thing. It is understandable why that resentment began to build, but that isn't an excuse, and it would come to a head in a very catastrophic way. However, in terms of being a parent, he doesn't seem to have actually been all that bad. yes, things would certainly go south afterward, but that was after his time as Lion's quote-unquote father had come to an end. By that time, they were functioning more like battle brothers, because even though Luther was too old to be made into a space marine, he was still able to have all his physical abilities heightened and have his aging severely decreased in the way space marines are. I don't say immortal because space marines do in fact age, and that does wear on them as they go on, but we don't know how old they can be without dying when they're not in the Eye of Terror. What I'm saying here is he wasn't really in a fatherly role to him anymore, and was serving more so as his right-hand man, and that's when things started to go sideways. However, back when he was his father, when he found him in the woods and raised him, there's nothing to suggest that he was not a good parent to the lion. He took him in as one of his own, he treated him fairly, he nurtured him, he trained him, and he didn't stop his development as he started to surpass him as a lesser man might have. And I think that's where it becomes interesting, because I don't really know if it was entirely the lion's success that made him so threatened. It was the fact that he wasn't the lion's father anymore. That position as father, the reverence that comes with that, and just the nature of that relationship had fallen away, and that's kind of hard to cope with. Like, becoming someone's parent to just being transferred into being their equal/co-worker is not really an easy thing to go through, and not something many people do go through. Like, I know a lot of people in my audience are on the older side and do have kids, so naturally as a parent, you want your child to surpass you in every way possible. Not just so that you can hitch yourself to their wagon, but because you want that for them. You want them to succeed. You want them to fly high. It's only natural. But the expectation there is that your child still looks to you, no matter how big they get, as their parent, and they still defer to you and respect that you have a level of at least a spiritual authority over them. Authority that you are, hopefully, doing the right thing with and leading them correctly, you know? But that had entirely fallen away with the Lion and Luther, and I think, even if it's not explicitly stated, that would have been a big factor. And I really hope that's something that gets explored more in the coming Scouring series, if we do get the destruction of Caliban in full and from a different perspective, because we have thus far only gotten bits and pieces of it. Next is Fulgrim, and he didn't really have much in the ways of parentage. You see, he landed on the barren world of Chemos, which was so resource-stricken that basically all luxuries and artistic pursuits had been sacrificed because every hand was needed to keep people alive and get the necessary resources to survive. So, they used their garbage mining equipment to eke out a living in the mines of Chemos. So when Fulgrim crashed on Chemos, 3 workers found him. One named Tuella, one named Corin, and one named Solax. Now this Solax one actually wanted to put Fulgrim to death because that was normally what happened to orphans on Chemos, so that they didn't become a strain on the system. They were that pressed for resources. But Tuella and Corin actually killed Solax in order to keep the identity of the child a secret until it was old enough to be revealed. This, as we know, happened very quickly, with Fulgrim becoming a full worker at half the required age and one of the planet's elite rulers by the age of 15, the so-called executives who helped keep everything managed. And from there, he would make sweeping reforms to the planet, elevating its technology, making people's lives easier, and bringing both art and luxury back to the barren world he had landed on. However, those 2 workers who had found him would not live to see this. They both died actually very early on, after pleading with the leaders of the world for the life of this child. You see, Chemos is an incredibly polluted world, so diseases are common amongst its populace, leading a lot of people to die from things like cancers and other degenerative conditions. And this took both of Fulgrim's adoptive parents. But it doesn't really seem like they made much of an impression on him. Yes, he remembers them, and yes, he does have gratitude towards them, but he only really thinks of them when he's considering how sad it is that they lived such short lives. Part of that is clearly the impetus for why he wanted to improve the conditions on Chemos for the people, but I feel like he would have done that anyway even if the 2 of them had lived. That's not to say, however, he doesn't remember them fondly in some way. From the book Fulgrim the Palatine Phoenix, we get this excerpt. Corin and Tuella had been capable parents at best. Life in the fortress factory of Calax had broken them early, and they withered even as he flourished. He rotated his wrists, angling the blade, and brought it around until it extended towards an isolated nook. There, 2 small plinths stood. Atop each plinth was a bust, one of Corin and one of Tuella. Plain marble, with no color or gilt to distinguish them, almost identical in their expressions of weary acceptance. It was hard to tell which was which at times, even for him. "You did the best you could," he said softly in benediction. Their imperfections had been no fault of their own. He spun on his heel, drawing the sword up in a savage cut. He had taken control of Calax within a few months of being put to work there. Chemos had been dying then, its mines tapped and its ores plundered. It should be noted, though, he's not specifically going to their graves to mourn them or to mark an anniversary of anything. He just has those busts aboard his ship, and he turns to them and says this while he's contemplating something else. The fact that some swordsman tribes on Chemos that he had learned swordsmanship from had to be basically broken up and dispersed among the planet's population because they had opposed his rule and his vision. So aside from the fact that they, didn't kill him with a rock when they found him, they don't seem to have had much of an impact on his life. They can't really be said to have much bearing on either his good or negative qualities, and sure, he does think on them fondly, but not much and not often. Next is Dammekos, adoptive father of Perturabo, Primarch of the Iron Warriors, and this one is famous. You see, while some Primarchs would be adopted by average people and some by nobody at all, some would be adopted by people in positions of nobility and power. However, that is not always a good thing. You see, on the planet of Olympia, Perturabo, the future Primarch of the Iron Warriors, would land, and he would live there alone for several years before being brought before and adopted by the leader of one of the fortress towns of Olympia, named Dammekos. You see, Olympia was divided into several city-states, kind of like ancient Greece. And the largest of them, Lokos, was ruled by Dammekos, and he put Perturabo's innate talents for technology and engineering to use, crushing his enemies and conquering more and more of the planet, until it was almost entirely under his rule by the time the Emperor came by and picked Perturabo up. Dammekos would then be assigned the governorship of the world and rule it until his death. But that's where things stop being simple, because as Perturabo saw it, Dammekos was basically just using him as a weapon, fostering those talents that were useful to him and not really caring about the rest. Perturabo wanted to create more than anything, and he did get opportunities to do so when his horrible attitude wasn't getting in the way. However, he felt he was only being used to destroy. So, that's why he was happy to go with the Emperor when he came to Olympia, because he thought things would be different, and when they turned out really not to be, that was part of why he became so bitter and sided with Horus. Alright then, so I guess Dammekos just sucked, and he was only using Perturabo, and that gave him a big complex. But the problem is, that might not be how it actually happened. In the book Perturabo, the Hammer of Olympia, we get scenes from his father's perspective, and Dammekos seems to be trying to connect with Perturabo. An example of this is at Perturabo's naming ceremony, when he's meant to be around 16 years old, but he looks like he's 30, with the beard and the face of a general. Now, all the other boys that age who are also set to receive their names are drinking, and flirting with girls, and roughhousing, and engaging in poetic discourse, and so on. They're acting up and really getting into the spirit of things. But Perturabo is off in the corner, brooding and glaring at everyone wasting food and time. And the whole time, Dammekos was side-eyeing him, having hoped that Perturabo at least for today would let loose and enjoy himself, but knowing that he wasn't going to, and that he can't force him to. And when the time comes for Perturabo to select a new name, he opts to stick with Perturabo, which is actually something that's supposed to be considered scandalous because that's not an Olympian name at all. But Dammekos basically says, hey, that's totally fine. If he wants to be Perturabo, then Perturabo he is. He's my adoptive son after all, he's part of my family. And this is certainly meant as a mix of both posturing, public display of good nature, but also genuine affection. He is on some level trying to reach out to Perturabo, even if part of that motivation was probably to keep up public appearances, because it looks bad for a ruler to have this weird brooding son. So with all that in mind, it really does seem that Dammekos was not that bad of a father. He tried to do the right thing, he tried to connect with Perturabo, but Perturabo was just too aloof and difficult. And that's something that needs to be noted, because in parts of this video, it's gonna seem like at times, oh, it's all the parents' fault for being bad, or the lack of parentage that caused problems. But no, the Primarchs themselves do bear a level of agency and responsibility with regard to how they turned out, for better or for worse. However, I would like to state that Dammekos was by no means perfect. For example, he was continually plotting against Perturabo and the Imperium after Perturabo left, and even though Perturabo knew about this, he didn't do anything about it. But this would all come to a head after Dammekos died and the world went into real rebellion. A rebellion that Perturabo absolutely annihilated. And we learn from Caliphany, Perturabo's adoptive sister and likely the only person he ever truly loved or cared about, that he was, quote, a black-hearted man, because he drowned his eldest son Heracon in a vat of wine after he tried to overthrow him, with Caliphany commenting that exile would have been more fitting. But here's the thing. That's kinda something Perturabo would do, isn't it? Like, I went over what Perturabo was like back during the Crusade and Heresy era in my video discussing his wider character arc, and he would absolutely beat his own sons to death, or at least near to it, for even the slightest bit of bad news, and was constantly paranoid about some of his higher-ranking sons wanting to quote-unquote take his place even though they obviously couldn't, one of them being Thorax. So perhaps, in a way, Perturabo is far more like Dammekos than he would ever want to admit. Next on the list is Ong Kahn, the adopted father of Jaghatai Khan, the Primarch of the White Scars. And out of all the Primarch parents we know of, I would say we might have the least to go on regarding Ong Kahn. In fact, I looked through Jaghatai's Primarch book, Warhawk of Chagoris, and he's not even in there. The only time he's ever mentioned is in the Index Astartes Volume 1, released in 2002. You see, Ong Kahn was the leader of a nomadic tribe called the Talaskars, and he would adopt Jaghatai Khan after he found him on the empty windswept steppes, seeing him as someone with, quote, fire in his eyes. He would raise Jaghatai for years as part of the tribe, but we don't really know what their relationship was like in the same way we do with, say, Perturabo and Dammekos. What we do know, though, is that in the tribal warfare of the steppe, he would be killed, and Jaghatai would be so affronted by this that he would assume uncontested leadership of the tribe and lead them in a raid against the offending tribe, wiping them out entirely. Men, women, children, and even mounting the head of their chieftain above his tent. After this, though, he would stop himself, and resolve to unite all the tribes of what was his planet's version of Mongolia, because his planet was basically divided into Imperial China and Mongolia, in order to stop this cycle of violence and bloodshed amongst his people. From there, he would go on to wage war against the Imperial part of the planet, known as the Palatine, from his location called the Empty Quarter, and win, uniting the entire world by the time the Emperor showed up. So while we don't get much about him, it's clear Ong Kahn meant a lot to Jaghatai, but the main point of his story is to show that Jaghatai is someone who values loyalty and honor above all else, and is not afraid to punish those he deems to be in the wrong with as much force as necessary. Furthermore, it also goes to show that Jaghatai is absolutely capable of restraint, because after he won, he did stop himself and resolve to bring peace to his world, which he did do. What's really interesting, though, is the fact that Ong Kahn was a real person. He was actually a friend of the father of Genghis Khan, and after Genghis Khan's father died and his family was left on their own, he would actually take on the young Genghis, named Temujin, as a retainer, and give him his start as a warrior and leader of men, as opposed to just some nobody on the steppe. But they would eventually have a falling out, where Genghis would defeat him and a former friend who had united against him in battle, and the real Ong Kahn would meet his end very ignobly, where after being defeated by Genghis Khan, he and Genghis's friend Jamukha would flee to another tribe called the Naimans seeking shelter, and while Jamukha was let through, the guard who met them would say, "There's no way this random old guy is the real Ong Kahn, he's lying," and just killed him with a spear on the spot. So the real Ong Kahn was a real steppe leader, and was the patron for a time of Genghis Khan, but that's really where the similarities between him and the Ong Kahn of Warhammer end. Next is actually a twofer, and I think this is also one of the ones I got wrong when I initially did this video, because it is both the She-Wolf and King Thengir, the two different adoptive parents of Leman Russ, Primarch of the Space Wolves. You see, initially I had only cited the She-Wolf, but forgot to mention King Thengir. But in my defense, both the She-Wolf and Thengir are only mentioned in one source, and it's even older than Jaghatai Khan's source citing Ong Kahn. It's not even the Index Astartes. It's one page in White Dwarf magazine, specifically issue number 117. from 1989. And the entire passage is just this. Thus it was on the planet of Fenris that a mewling infant was discovered by a she-wolf as she hunted for her newborn cubs. A lesser child would have been torn apart by the giant wolf that stood as tall as a man. But no such fate would befall this golden man cub with eyes like a wolf king. Gently, taking the child in her mighty paws, the she-wolf bore him back to the safety of her cave, where he grew up amongst the wolf pack as part of the she-wolf's family. Within a few short years, the child was an adult, for as a Primarch he was more than a normal man and grew as rapidly as his wolf brothers. He might have lived out all his years with the wolves, had not Thengir, king of the people of Rus, set his hunters out into the forest to clear the pack from his land. The old grey she-wolf and many of her cubs and clawkin died upon the spears and arrows of the king's hunters, but the wolfman was spared and brought, bound and gagged before King Thengir himself. The king took the wild man from the forests into his care and named him Leman, Leman of the Rus. Amongst men for the first time in his life, Leman quickly learned their skills, showing a natural aptitude for the way of the warrior. He mastered their weapons, iron axes and swords, and won many glorious victories. Great tales were told of his strength and courage, how he could pluck a tree from the ground and break it over his knee, how he could stand against 100 men in battle, and, within mere minutes, have them begging for mercy, and how he could consume an entire ox and wash it down with a whole barrel of beer. When Thengir died, Leman became king of the Rus. Under his leadership, they won many victories, for in battle, Leman was all but invincible. When his armies marched, the howling of wolves heralded their path. When he fought, a pair of giant wolves battled by his side. Kings themselves, they were Freki and Geri, his wolf brothers that had escaped from the king's hunters, and now had countless wolf packs of their own to command. The tales of King Leman were told far and wide, and came to the notice of the Emperor himself. Recognizing the power of a Primarch at work, he traveled to Fenris and confronted the Wolf King, who blindly refused to pay him homage as the master of mankind. This right here is basically about the same amount of information we got as Jagatai Khan, even if it does have a few more words to it. And one thing, how would the Emperor have gotten word of Leman Russ, considering Fenris was an isolated planet with no contact to the outside galaxy? This just implies that somehow rumors made their way back to the Emperor's ears, as opposed to what many people assume, which is that he could sense that a Primarch was on that world when he got near enough to it, or when the Great Crusade stretched close enough to it. That would be one thing, but word of this Wolf King's exploits doesn't make that much sense when you think about it, unless the Emperor somehow managed to get spies onto the planet beforehand. I would say though, I think this passage actually does tell us a little bit less, because while it is clear that Jagatai Khan was deeply loyal to Ong Kahn and quite possibly liked him, we get no indication what Leman Russ's relationship to Thengir was, especially considering he was responsible for the death of the She-Wolf. And we don't know much about what happened during Russ's time with the She-Wolf, only that he was there and that he was raised alongside her wolf pack. Also, the story of those two wolf siblings of Leman, Freki and Geri, is also inconsistent, because one is implied to have been killed and the other was overtly killed by Magnus the Red during the Battle of Prospero. However, both of them show up later in the novel Wolfsbane, which takes place near the end of the heresy. All we can really get out of this information about Leman's upbringing is the fact that he is a very wild and savage person, but if I'm being honest, he probably wouldn't have turned out that much different had he been raised in normal Rus society. And I keep saying Rus even though I know it is pronounced Rus, sorry about that. Another one that we don't have much information about but is actually more substantive happens to not be an adoptive parent but rather an adoptive grandparent. And of course I'm talking about the adoptive grandfather of Rogel Dorn, Primarch of the Imperial Fists. You see, Rogel Dorn would land on the ice world of Inuit, which, despite being very technologically desolate and not very resource-rich, was still pretty technologically advanced, with some solid remnants left over from Old Night, which had allowed them to create their own little system empire. Despite this though, Inuit was not a united planet, but was rather under the control of various clans and houses, one of them being the House of Dorn. And it would be into the House of Dorn that Rogel Dorn would be adopted. We don't know how he was found or how old he was at the time, but we do know that the patriarch of the clan would take him on as his adopted grandson. And interestingly, Dorn did not know about this. You see, for most other Primarchs, they seem to have been at least on some level aware from the minute they were born, and as such, knew they were adopted. Guilliman knew he was not Conor Guilliman's biological son, Lion knew Luther was not his real father, and so on. But Dorn would only find out that he was not biologically related to his grandfather later down the line. However, despite this, he would continue to hold his grandfather, quote-unquote, in very high regard. And I don't just mean a sort of respect for him, but a genuine kind of affection. And this is because, famously, he would not only keep his grandfather's robe, but also sleep with it on his bed every night. From The Lightning Tower by Dan Abnett. Some of the sullen stars were orbital platforms, catching the last backscatter of the sunlight as Terra turned. Dorn put on a fur-edged robe that had been in his possession since his adolescence on Inwit, and went out to walk the parapets of the Dawalagiri Prospect, to dwell upon its beauty one last time. It was one of the last sections of the palace that remained untouched. Adamantine armor plates, drab, pre-stressed rockcrete and auto turrets had yet to blight its ethereal lines. The robe had been his grandfather's, though Dorn had long since understood that no ties of blood linked him to the Inwit ice caste that had raised him. He had been created from another genetic line, the most singular line, in a sterile vault deep beneath him in the buried core of the palace. Not a palace. Not the palace anymore. A fortress. Dorn had been built to rule, built to assist in his father's tireless ambitions, built to make the hard decisions. He had been made as a Primarch, one of only 20 in the galaxy, engineered by the master architect of mankind, the archmason of genetic code. The Imperium needs many things, but foremost it needs the ability to protect itself, to attack when necessary. That's why I gave it 20 strong teeth in its mouth. Attacking was a remarkably easy thing to do. Dorn's physical prowess humbled all but 20 human beings in creation, and those 20 were his father and his 19 brothers. In Dorn's opinion, the real art was knowing when not to attack. His grandfather, the old Inwit sire, patriarch of the Ice Hive clan, had taught him that. Dorn had been the 7th lost son to be reclaimed. By the time his father's forces found him, he had become a system warlord in his own right, ruling the Inwit cluster as the head of the House of Dorn. His grandfather had been dead 40 winters, but still, the warlord had slept with the fur-edged robe across his body at night. His people called him Emperor, until the true meaning of the title had been demonstrated by 1,000 warships in the Inwit sky. Firstly, that's absolutely adorable. Secondly, it's not just in his flagship or aboard the Phalanx. He brought this robe with him, that he sleeps with, to Terra in order to oversee the fortification of the palace before the heresy broke out. Yes, the heresy would break out after, but he brought this with him on what he thought was basically a side quest to just spruce up the palace and make it more formidable. It's so important to him that he thought, no, wait, I gotta bring this with me, it's important. Like he will not go anywhere without it, seemingly. Also, Dorn would be rediscovered in M30-835, by which time his grandfather had been dead for 40 years. And the Horus Heresy broke out in M31-005, meaning Dorn has hung on to and slept with this robe for the past 210 years. And not only that, but here he is, overseeing the reconstruction of the Imperial Palace into a fortress fit to withstand Horus Lupercal's assault, gazing out at the last scraps of untouched beauty on what was essentially the most impressive human building in the entire galaxy. That is an incredibly poignant and heavy moment, and there's a million different things that could be going through his mind at that time. But what is he thinking about? Lessons his grandfather imparted to him over 2 centuries prior. It is clear that Rogel Dorn loved this man and loved him dearly. In fact, I would say, from what we can tell, Rogel Dorn was probably the closest to his adoptive family out of any of the Primarchs, aside from only Rabute Guilliman. Now, on that mushy note, who's up for a good old-fashioned U-turn? Because next on the list is Konrad Curze, Primarch of the Night Lords. And the astute among you might have noticed I didn't say blank, adoptive blank of Konrad Curze, Primarch of the Night Lords. I just started hauling off into Konrad. And that's because there is nobody. Konrad Curze is one of those few Primarchs who was never adopted by anyone at all and had to raise himself. You see, Konrad would land on the world of Nostromo, which was basically Gotham but the size of a planet. It was dark all the time, it was covered in dense urban sprawl, it was deeply unequal economically, and it was probably the galactic capital of crime. But rather than be taken in by anyone, he would survive on his own, using his wits and abilities to stay alive on the streets of one of Nostromo's 5 cities, specifically Nostromo Quintus. And here, he would begin to be plagued by those dark visions that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Now, generally speaking, in this video, I've been discussing how each Primarch's adoptive parentage helped to shape them prior to the Emperor finding them. But here we look at the opposite. What did the lack of parentage do to Konrad Curze? And how might this have been different if someone had taken him in? You see, Konrad would see the ills of Nostromo Quintus and resolve to do something about it. Problem was, he couldn't launch a change.org petition, so he had to go with the next best thing: killing anybody who looked like they might be doing wrong. Initially, this started out with him intervening in crimes he actively saw, killing whoever was committing the crime. But this would then extend to more quote-unquote preventative measures, where he would cut down and butcher anybody he viewed as even slightly responsible for any kind of unrest in the system. You see, it would start with corrupt officials and bureaucrats, gang leaders, and violent offenders, but then extend towards minor offenders, and even vocal opposition leaders. And this would continue on to protesters, and then basically anyone with any kind of money who didn't immediately swear fealty to him. And yes, I do mean fealty, because he inflicted such a reign of terror upon Nostromo Quintus that he would become a terrifying legend, the Night Haunter. Something that was so scary to people that an entire curfew formed around avoiding him. Not anything formally enforced, but understood as a necessity to not be ripped apart. And then he would leverage that fearsome reputation to become the King of Nostromo Quintus, and then eventually all 5 cities of Nostromo. But we have to ask ourselves, how much was this sort of inevitable given the circumstances, such as his horrifying mental health and the absolutely abysmal state of Nostromo? Or would someone taking him in at a young age have actually helped to mitigate some of these factors? I think it would have, because as cruel and sadistic as Konrad Curze can be, we do see these glimmers in him that prove he's not completely heartless. He shows genuine concern when he thinks Sanguinius is about to die, and he had a good relationship with Fulgrim for quite some time, until Fulgrim basically betrayed his trust by narking on his visions to Rogel Dorn. Now, I want to particularly zero in on that second one there, because we saw how Konrad Curze functioned when in the presence of family. He was better. His horrific visions were lessened. He was more stable. He wasn't brooding quite as much. Sure, he was still violent and believed in terror as a means of control, but still, he was doing better. So, if he had been raised with those values, with a family, with people he cared about, he likely would not have been quite so bad. Sure, he would have still seen the social ills of Nostromo, but he would have also had context to view innocent people as just that, innocent. That there are people who need to be protected, and that fear should not be used to basically beat everybody into line, because he was also killing vocal members of the opposition, and even protesters, because he viewed them as a catalyst for unrest and disorder. So, they fell in his line of sight too. But if he had been raised by some regular people who found him, he then might have become, ironically, more like Corvus Corax, Primarch of the Raven Guard, who was, in his own words, the only one of his brothers who he actually hated, because Corax to him represented everything he couldn't be, despite coming from a very similar background. I don't doubt for a second that he still would have been absolutely tearing people apart, but that anger would have been directed, I don't want to say at the right people, but at a more focused group of people as opposed to everybody, because he would then have had context for the value of a human life. However, someone who absolutely did learn the value of human life because of their upbringing, and didn't have a clear single adoptive parent, was number 9, Sanguinius, Primarch of the Blood Angels, because he would land on the irradiated desert moon of Baal Secundus. We have 2 main sources for Sanguinius' upbringing on Baal, and they come from, first there was the Index Astartes Volume 2, published in 2003, and then the Horus Heresy Campaign Book number 8, Malevolence, published in 2019. And it's largely consistent across both versions, where Sanguinius is again not adopted by a single person, but rather an entire tribe, called the Pure of the Blood. You see, most people on Ba Secundus were heavily mutated because of course they were living on a moon-sized version of Pripyat. And this was a problem because a lot of those mutants were not peaceful. They were violent and barbarous. The Pure of the Blood, however, were largely unmutated and comparatively peaceful. They would find the young Sanguinius and, ironically, actually consider putting him to death, not too dissimilarly from Fulgrim, but instead of resources, it was because he had 2 wings sprouting out of his back, and they viewed this as a sign of mutation, which, to be fair, it was. However, compassion won out, and they decided to keep him alive and bring him into the fold. And of course, as with all Primarchs, he grew preternaturally fast and was infinitely capable, and became a massive boon to them, becoming the greatest warrior among them by far, and helping defend them time and again from the hordes of mutants. His reputation would grow, and eventually, he would unite all the unmutated tribes of people, and take control of the planet from the savage hordes. It wasn't comfortable or advanced by any means, but it was certainly livable, and for this, he would become viewed as a god by the people of Baal. The most notable difference between the two sources, though, is the fact that in the Index Astartes, Sanguinius is found as an infant, and then, at 3 weeks old, he's the size of a 3-year-old, where he wandered into a giant fire scorpion's pit and managed to kill the venomous beast that was twice the size of a normal man. Then, by 1 year, he was fully grown and leading the tribe. However, in Horus Heresy number 8, he seems to have been a little bit older by the time he was found. Still though, the end result was the same. Sanguinius grew into a being of compassion and someone who deeply values protecting the innocent, because he was raised among comparatively innocent and kind people. Yes, they had considered killing him as a child, but they held off on it, and that's what counts. He would see the value in protecting people and gain a love of humanity. He saw the good in people springing up even in the hardest situations, whereas Conrad Kurz, by contrast, saw the worst of humanity, which caused them both to adopt very different ethoses in regard to human control. Sanguinius actually had a very laissez-faire attitude with regard to how people should govern themselves as long as they're doing right. And this likely owes to the fact that Sanguinius's upbringing wasn't done with the oversight of a lord or leader, such as with Rogel Dorn or Jagatai Khan, who developed keen senses of just autocracy, but rather was a much smaller, more humanist upbringing around common people, emphasizing the need to protect civilians and let them decide their own affairs, because when left on their own, they will come together and do what is right and good. This is something that he shares in common both in terms of values and upbringing with Vulcan of the Salamanders and Korax of the Raven Guard. And lastly for this video is Ferrus Manus of the Iron Hands. Now, here is another situation where a Primarch was raised by no one. And I should note, yes, he is the last for this video because I am splitting it into 2 parts. It's already run pretty long, I'm only halfway through, and my videos have been really long as of late, which has led me to being pretty overworked, so I'm trying to tone it down. You see, when Ferrus Manus crash-landed on the planet of Medusa, he would actually accidentally awaken a giant metal worm, which was actually revealed to be a Necron construct of sorts, because Medusa did have Necrons on it. And he would then swear an oath that he would destroy the beast, considering he's the one who unleashed it. So he would stay in the mountains of Medusa alone, not interacting with the clans of the world, but observing them from afar. And as he hunted the great beasts, he would become kind of an urban legend to the people of Medusa, gaining many different names, such as the Cataclysm or the Finality, among different clans. And he actually liked the fact that the clans weren't unified, because them fighting against each other meant that they were constantly adjusting themselves and growing stronger. Weaker elements were purged, and strength had to come through adaptation and sheer test. In fact, he would continually test himself every way he could, hunting larger beasts, swimming the vast oceans, climbing the highest peaks, and so on and so on. He would though, however, confirm his existence to these clans by descending from the mountain and again letting them do as they were without his interference. Eventually though, he would kill that great worm, and his arms would become covered in its molten liquid metal body after he basically had to drown it in magma to finally do it in. And that would be the story of how he got his metal arms. Here's the problem though. We never get much characterization for what Ferrus Manus is really like, given that he's the first Primarch to die. In fact, many people consider that his only real function in the narrative. So, we can't really get a feel of him that clearly regarding how he might have been shaped by his specific isolated upbringing. Because it's interesting that he does seem to be pretty ornery and temperamental and quick to agitation. He's also very, very frosty with a lot of his brothers, never being warm or affectionate with any of them other than Fulgrim and Vulcan. What's interesting though is the fact that Jagatai Khan wanted to end the violence of the steppe, or empty quarter I should say, on Chagoris because he personally had lost someone he looked up to and admired. But Ferrus Manus was totally fine to let the clans of Medusa infight and war with each other because he hadn't lost anyone he was invested in, and saw the more pragmatic picture of the infighting breeding strength. So this isolated, detached upbringing might actually be why he was such a great general. This is actually commented on by Horus Lupercal after the heresy starts, where he repeatedly laments that Ferrus Manus couldn't be brought on side, saying that Ferrus Manus was key to his plans and that if they had Ferrus Manus they would be at the gates of Terra by now, and that Ferrus understood war better than any of his brothers, not just combat or leading, but war in its essence. He never really elaborates on what that means, but I think this could be a bit of an insight into that. But what do you guys think? Not just regarding Ferrus Manus, but the Primarchs in general, or at least the ones discussed in this video, because I will be getting to the other 9, well, 10 in the next video, which will be coming next week, so you won't have to wait very long. Do you guys agree with my assessments regarding the Primarchs' parentage, such as how it shaped them going into their adulthood, or do you believe a lot of their qualities were more inherent based on their creation, and as such were more or less inevitable? As always, I would love to hear what you guys have to say in the comments below, as I do read every single one. Please subscribe if you have not already done so, consider supporting me on Patreon if you can, and joining my Discord server linked down below, and until then I will see you in the next video.